Te tiriti o waitangi, the founding document of New Zealand. This has been a major cause of contention in local politics for the last 186 years, and especially recently with our current government. But why? That's what we are going to be breaking down today in this video. So yes, kia ora koutou, I'm Tawipi, and I'm Māori. Māori are the indigenous people of New Zealand, or as we call it in Te Reo Māori, the Māori language, Aotearoa. Now then, both due to the fact that this is an incredibly important document, and also due to the fact that the chiefs of Mai Tupuna, those hundreds of years ago, signed this very document, I feel compelled to make this video both to fight back against the myths spread about it, and also to share and teach everyone about both our culture and our history, and especially about the words used in this document, which seem to go on deaf ears to some people. So yeah, let's get into this. Alright, so there are many issues of the document that have both been talked about repeatedly online and in Parliament for years on end now. But in order for this video not to go over like 5 hours, we're going to focus on one very important point, which is the primary issue with this document. And that is the blatant mistranslation between both the English and Māori versions of this document. And in specific, to the first and second articles of Te Tiriti. But before we get into this document, first we need to go through its history. Te Tiriti o Waitangi, also known as the Treaty of Waitangi, was a document first signed by 40 chiefs at Waitangi, and later by a total of 540 chiefs total across of all of Aotearoa in 1840, with only 39 chiefs, may I mind you, signing the English version of this document. The purpose? Supposedly, to create and establish an agreement between both Māori and Pākehā, specifically to the British Crown, to control the British subjects in Aotearoa while protecting the sovereignty of Māori iwi, also known as tribes, and to keep other colonial powers away from Aotearoa, such as the French. However, based on the actions of the Crown after, and by reading the English version of Te Tiriti, this is also clearly an attempt by the Crown to claim Aotearoa for itself and set up colonies legally, shall we say, before any other colonial powers could seize it. As well as this, at the time, the French had a great interest in Aotearoa, so it was considered a strategic move for the British Crown in their rivalry with the French. Now then, to add extra detail to this, the Tiriti o Waitangi is the foundational document of the modern New Zealand Parliament, as it was what allowed for the British to set up colonies and for settlers to legally own land and set up Parliament here. And as well as this, it was left to rot in a basement and completely near forgotten about for over 100 years. To re-emphasize this, the document which gave the Crown the supposed legal right to colonize and own New Zealand as its own was not only not followed by the Crown on their own half, but nearly completely forgotten about and left to rot in a basement for 100 years. Now then, for the actual document itself, it was highly rushed. Lieutenant Governor William Hobson was tasked with overseeing the New Zealand colony and employed James Busby with the drafting of the Treaty of Waitangi. This being done in a mere few days. Doesn't sound like a very good idea if you ask me, but hey, you do what you do, I guess. And the translation of the document to Māori? That was done overnight by Henry Williamson and his son, Edward. So yeah, as you can tell, this is not going very well already. And as you can imagine, a rushed document and an even more rushed translation is set up to fail from the start. Who would have figured? So now we come to the main point of this video. What is the difference between the document in both English and Māori? Now then, the primary point of contention comes from the choices of words used by Henry and how Māori understood these concepts in comparison to British at the time. These two words specifically were kāwangatanga and tino rangatiratanga. We will go into more detail later about the definitions of these words, but for now, just think of kāwangatanga as governance or governmentship, and tino rangatiratanga as sovereignty. Now to begin with, here is a quote from the first verse of Te Tiriti in which the word kāwangatanga is used. ko ngā rangatira o te wakamitenga me ngā rangatira katoa hoki, ki te haui uru, ki taua watamitenga, ka tuku rawa atu ki te kuini o ingirangi a ke tonu atu, te kāwangatanga katoa o ō rātou wenua. Now here, the main issue is the use of the word kāwangatanga. Now then, to break down the word kāwangatanga, first we must break it down into its two separate parts. The word kāwana is a literal transliteration of the English word govern into Māori, and tanga turns it into governmentship or governance, depending on who you ask. Now, as you can imagine, as this was an English origin word, a majority of Māori had very little idea of what it truly meant. And as well as this, the main exposure that Māori did have to this word was from the Māori translation of the Bible, where it was used to describe a father-like authority. Now, if we compare this to the English version of the first article of Te Tiriti, the chiefs of the Confederation of the United Tribes of New Zealand and separate and independent chiefs who have not become members of the Confederation cede to Her Majesty the Queen of England absolute and without reservation all rights and powers of sovereignty which they said Confederation or individual chiefs respectively exercise or possess, or may be supposed to exercise or to possess over their respective territories as their sole sovereign thereof. The primary issue of this is that sovereignty is a highly different concept to governmentship. It has been suggested that rather than kāwangatanga, the word mana, which can be translated to authority in this instance, may have been a more correct translation for the word sovereignty. However, again, as Māori didn't have a concept of sovereignty being something that you can cede, i.e. being controlled by a foreign power, it is likely that the word may have been changed to governmentship to make it more understandable to Māori of the time. However, again, a second suggestion is that it was likely a purposeful choice, as if Māori understood ceding sovereignty as ceding mana, it is highly unlikely any chiefs would have signed or even turned up to sign Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Now then, let's get into the second big issue of this translation of Te Tiriti, quoting from Article 2, in which the word tino rangatiratanga is featured. Ko te kuini o ingirangi ka wakarite, ka wakaae, ki ngā rangatira, ki ngā hupu, ki ngā tangata katoa o nūtirani, te tino rangatiratanga o wō rātou wenua, o rātou kāinga me o rātou taonga katoa. O te ia ko ngā rangatira o te wakamitenga, me ngā rangatira katoa atu, ka tuku ki te kuini, te hokonga o e rā wahi wenua, e pai ai te tangata nona te wenua. Ki te ritinga o te utu e wakarite ai, a e rātou ko te kaihoko e mea tia nei, e te kuini hei kaihoko mona. Now then, as I said before, tino rangatiratanga is the most important part of this section. The word tino rangatiratanga can be translated as absolute chiefly authority. Now, if we translate the whole second article, rather than reading the English version of the second article, it can be read as this. The Queen of England agreed to protect the chiefs, the sub-tribes, and all people of New Zealand in the unqualified exercise of their chieftainship over their land, villages, and all their treasures. Now, this can be very easily interpreted as Māori keep sovereignty. However, if you notice, this is already at odds with the first section of the English version of the Treaty of Waitangi, which states Māori will cede their sovereignty. Now, if we look at the English documents version of the second article, Her Majesty, the Queen of England, confirms and guarantees to the chiefs and tribes of New Zealand and to the respective families and individuals thereof the full, exclusive, and undisturbed possession of their lands and estates, forests, fisheries, and other properties which they may collective or individually possess, so long as they wish and desire to retain in the same their possession. By the chiefs of the United Tribes and individual chiefs to yield to Her Majesty the exclusive right of preemption over such lands as properties therefore may be disposed to alienate at such prices as may be agreed upon between the respective proprietors and persons appointed by Her Majesty to treat them in behalf. Now this version states that Māori keep the rights to their properties and possessions, however, there is no mention of sovereignty at all. If we are to now compare the two articles in English versus Māori, we see that in the Māori version signed by most chiefs, Māori ceded governmentship, not sovereignty, and Māori sovereignty was protected by the Crown. as juxtaposed to the English version signed by less than a quarter of these chiefs. Māori ceded sovereignty, Māori only had rights to their properties, possessions, and must sell to the Queen. Now, of course, the Crown didn't follow the English version of the Treaty of Waitangi either. However, that would be too long of a video to explain. Well then, I hope this helped explain and teach you something new, or maybe just reinforce something you already knew about the tiriti o waitangi and or Māori history. So yeah, ngā mihi nui, mō wō koutou mā toki mai nei. And yeah, before I go, here is me reading out the full tiriti o waitangi directly as it is written. Ka kite. Te tiriti o waitangi. Ko wikitoria te kuini o Ingirangi I tana mahara atawai ki ngā rangatira me ngā hapu o Nutirani. I tana hia hoki, ka tohungia ki a rātou o rātou rangatiratanga me tō rātou wenua. Kia mau tonu hoki, te rongo ki a rātou me te atanoho hoki, ko a hakaro ia, he mea tika kia tukutia mai tētahi rangatira. Hei kai wakarite ki ngā tangata Māori o Nutirani. Kia waka ai e tia, e ngā rangatira Māori, te kawanatanga o te kuini, ki ngā wahi katoa o te wenua nei me ngā motu. Nā te mea hoki, e toko maha ke ngā tāngata tō tōna iwi kua noho ki tēnei wenua. E haere mai nei. Nā, ko te kuini e hiei ana, kia wakarite anga te kawangatanga, kia kaua ai ngā kino e puta mai ki ngā tangata Māori, ki te Pākehā e noho ture kore ai. Nā, kua pai te kuini kia tukua haua wiremu hopi hona, he kapitana I roira, nawi, he kawana mō ngā wahi katoa o Nutirani e tukua na ia nei a mua, atu ki te kuini. E mea atu ana ia ki ngā rangatira o te wakamitenga o ngā hapu o Nutirani, me era rangatira atu I ēnei ture ka kore ai. O te tuatahi, ko ngā rangatira o te wakamitenga, me ngā rangatira katoa hoki, ki hai uru, ki taua wakamitenga, ka tukurawa atu ki te kuini o Ngirangi ake, tonu atu. Te kawangatanga katoa o rātou wenua. Ko te tuarua. Ko te kuini o Ingirangi, ka wakarite, ka wakaaea, ki ngā rangatira, ki ngā hapu, ki ngā tangata katoa a Nutirani, te tino rangatiretanga o rātou wenua, o rātou kainga, me o rātou taonga katoa. O te ia ko ngā rangatira o Witemitenga, me ngā rangatira katoa atu ka tuku ki te kuini, te okunga o era wahi wenua, e pai ai te tangata nōna te wenua. Ki te rite o te utu e waka ritea ai, te rātou ko te kai hoko e meitia nei, e te kuini, hei kai hoko mona. Ko te tuatoru. Hei waka ritea mai hoki I tēnei o te waka aiatanga o te kawatanga o te kuini. Ka tiakina I te kuini o Ingirangi ngā tangata Māori katoa o Nutirani, ka tukua ki a rātou ngā tangata, ngā tikanga katoa. Te ki tahi ki ana mea ki ngā tangata o Ingirangi. Nā, ko mātou ko ngā rangatira e wakamitenga o ngā hapu o Nutirani. Ka huhi nei waitangi mō mātou hoki, ko ngā rangatira o Nutirani, ka kite nei I te ritinga o ēnei kupu. Ka tangohia, ka wakaaetia, ka tōrātia e mātou. Koia ka tohungia ia o mātou ingoa o mātou tohu. Ka mea tia tēnei ki waitangi, I te ono o ngā rā pepueri, I te tau kotai mano, e waurau, e wā te kau o tātou ariki. Ko ngā rangatira o te wakamitanga. Au we he rongo, he roa te nai au we.